Look at this. Here we go.
All right, welcome back everybody to the Web3 Game Development Livestream. We're trying something brand new today. So I am in Austin. We are here for South by Southwest. We have never done an on-site program before, but this is going to be the first of many because I'm going to be doing this at GDC next week as well. So today, I'm really happy to be joined by Tony Parisi. Tony, thanks for joining us. Tony is a legend in virtual reality, in Web3. Tony, you should just kind of talk a little bit about what you've done, and then we'll dive right into the conversation about Web3 and how the whole landscape is changing.
Yeah, sure thing, John. It's just great to be here. John and I have become friends over the last couple of years, kind of doing this, working on Metaverse stuff together. Real kindred spirits, I think. So it was a delight to get invited to be here at the show. I've been working in the field of Metaverse technology for, believe it or not, over 30 years. It's really been a thing for that long. I'm an expert in 3D graphics, and I created 3D graphic standards, VRML, glTF, that GLTF people are using every day for any use of 3D on the web. So that's a very proud thing for me after working in this area for so long. I was also a technology executive at startups and large companies. I did a stint at Unity, the game engine company, for 6 years as their head of VR and AR fairly recently. Left that and was tapped on the shoulder by Neal Stephenson, the author who coined the term Metaverse. And he said he wanted to build a Metaverse company for everyone built on blockchain technology. So imagine the convergence of blockchain and VR 3D types of technologies. And I worked as a chief product officer there for 1.5 years. But then the siren call of getting back to making art called to me. I'm a musician as well. So now these days I'm working as an independent artist primarily, including having written a full musical, a rock opera called Judgment Day about the end of everything. Maybe timely. Let's see how that goes. And I'm doing all that in Metaverse technology on the blockchain as well as in real life. It's intended to be a real stage show. So it's a fascinating time for me, and it's great being here in Austin with you, live music capital of the world as well. This is so much fun, and I see you're rocking the Austin look today, John. So
yeah, the hat,
a little bit more.
The hat is definitely
when I get on a stage, you know.
Yeah, I'm when in Rome. I'm wearing the hat. I didn't wear the cowboy boots today just because no one can see my feet. But
there you go.
But I've got them.
Are you going to wear that to the panel? We're on a panel later today.
Yep, I'm going to wear it to the panel. And I've actually worn this while on a horse, so I feel like I'm not a complete poser. So awesome. I feel okay with it. Yeah. All right, well, let's begin the journey from the beginning. So we've got a lot of Web3 game developers that tune into this. We also have just people who are Web3 enthusiasts generally trying to learn about what's going on. But you got inspired by the idea of the Metaverse really early on. When you invented VRML, was that inspired by the work of Neal Stephenson? Like, what gave you the ideas for that?
Yeah, it actually was. So personal journey side of this was in the early 90s. I was already in tech. I was in the tech industry in Boston, actually. And my wife and I got in a van and drove across to California. She didn't want to stay living there. You know, she grew up her whole life there. And I'm from New England as well. We're like, new adventure. And I'd been working in internet tech a little bit already. Landed in California, started playing around with some real-time 3D graphics on PCs. Met a fellow named Mark Pesci, another fellow Bostonian actually, who'd also moved to California. And we had all read Neuromancer by William Gibson and Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. We were steeped in cyberpunk novels. And the internet was coming online and real-time 3D graphics were coming online literally at the same time, like on a PC, I mean real-time 3D. Where they were happening at the same time. Now, backdrop to this is the World Wide Web is actually just getting started. People are learning how to make a web page. And Mark was like, we're going to put 3D on the internet. And I was like, you mean like Neuromancer? And he said, yeah, Tony, like, duh. And I mean, he's a great visionary guy. But like I had coding chops that he didn't. He was like a networking programmer, whereas I was a 3D graphics and UI person. And we put together a prototype for the first ever 3D web browser. And I'm telling you, it was like people were barely making web pages, and we were taking 3D models and rendering them at the time, a standalone PC app that was a companion to a web browser. So
no mean feat in the 90s.
No, you click on a link in a web browser, it launches companion app, and it sent it a URL as a parameter, and it would load a 3D model off the internet. And then the big round trip was you could click on the 3D model, and that would launch another web page. So even though they weren't an integrated, 2D, 3D experience on the one window yet, it was showing that this stuff could work, right? And before long, web plugins came along, and I built the first 3D web plugin for browsers. And at the same time, we started going to these meetings of worldwide web developers. And Dave Raggett, who was on the original World Wide Web team creating the standards out of MIT, the original web consortium, put out a call for a 3D standard for the internet. He dubbed it a VR standard, and we went with that and called it virtual reality markup language. And then we renamed it to modeling language to be a little more 3D appropriate. And VRML became the thing. It became an international standard over the course of 5 years. And large companies and independent developers and artists and everyone were super excited to build the future. A lot of them really fueled by this Neil Stephenson Metaverse vision, which took a lot longer to reach fruition. I think we're here in a lot of ways now. I'm sure you and I want to talk about this in this segment. But at the time, we were showing really promising technology. There were really cool experiences being made that you needed to put a graphics card into a PC to really experience. You were getting your content over a dial-up modem, 9600 baud modem kind of thing. So the experiences were crude. Not everybody had the coverage on the hardware side to even be able to do this. And yet, we still did a lot of great stuff. But the hype and boom around that fizzled eventually by the late 90s, and VRML just sort of died commercially.
Why, do you think?
Well, for a couple of reasons I just said. I don't think the infrastructure was quite ready yet. You're trying to deliver this content over a very low bandwidth connection, though we actually engineered it to do pretty well for that, right? Most people didn't have the hardware to have the experience. But I think there's actually a third and most important reason, perhaps, is that folks weren't ready. I mean, folks on the consumer, consumption side of the content, there weren't enough for them that even knew how to deal with the web yet. And so this idea that they could be like spinning 3D models or walking through virtual universes, that was so far down the line for most end users. And the flip side of that is the content creators as well. Most folks did not have 3D modeling skills. That picture has changed a lot. And I think with AI, that's going to change even more. I'd love to talk to you about that. But at the moment, even just having the crafting ability to make 3D models, we didn't have scanning technology, any of that was really, really specialized. And it still is, but now there's millions of 3D modeling professionals on the planet. It's a very different situation than it was 25 plus years ago. So that, that fizzled, but VRML continued as a standard. And then we worked on some upgrades to that standard for a while, but pretty much that languished for about a decade and nothing happened until we get to glTF. But we can stop it there. So that's the origin story. That's the big old origin story. A handful of crazy, Bay Area, Northern California folks wanting to build cyberspace was the other name we used for it back then.
Along with the information superhighway. I remember all these old terms. So let's do a quick station identification. You're watching the Web3 Game Developer Livestream. We've already got a couple hundred people watching. So that's really awesome because you are here with an opportunity to ask questions live too. So Tony and I will have no problem keeping this conversation going over the next hour, but there's absolutely no reason you can't be a part of it. So you're present with one of the legends who created virtual reality as we know it today, the inventor of VRML, who's been involved in really all of the big things that have happened on the internet since then. And that brings us maybe forward to Web3, which we'll talk about a little bit. But please, we're broadcasting on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on X, on Twitch, on YouTube, all of these places you could ask a question. Oscar, our producer, he's there. You see him online. Oscar will happily take your question, put it on the screen, and we can talk about the questions you have. In fact, you could even join this live stream. If you have a camera, Oscar will even give you a link to StreamYard. You could jump right in and be part of the conversation. So this is a very open format. We're trying to almost build the metaverse version of this by making it a place you can come in and out of. So please ask your questions, be part of the conversation. All right, so I just said the word metaverse.
There we go.
We began with it. It almost feels weird in 2025 talking about the metaverse because it had all this hype a couple of years ago, and now it almost feels retro to use that term. And it's sort of like that's the panel we're going to be on at South by later today, is like, is it coming back?
I kind of am shocked they accepted our panel submission with the title Metaverse in it, but I think we were intentionally provocative in how we framed it, to say this is an update. Hey, it ain't dead yet, kind of thing, because or it isn't. It seems retro, but the fact is this is an evolving work in progress, and I think that's going to be one of the through lines of what we talk about in the panel today, right? It's no one end state. I mean, okay, maybe when we get to the holodeck and we can all just, dream up a world that it just appears around us in full 3D for real, like around us as holograms. Maybe then we've actually achieved it, but there's so many steps in between, and I think it's more of an aspirational idea of a set of technologies, a bunch of different experiences, right? Web3 and gaming, for example, being one of the major things. I think it's going to be thriving and driving action in there. So yeah, it is wild that we're going to be talking about this today, but as someone who's been working in the field, I've never shied away from it. It got pretty funny when Zuck started saying Metaverse and he rebranded the company. And then a lot of people were like, oh, we need a new word for it, And so I'm in this insider crew of industry people that argue over terms all the time. I don't know if it's the same in the world of Beamable and the pure Web3 gaming, but I got to tell you, like when it comes to XR, like VR, AR, all the pundits, all the tech experts like me, they start getting into these stupid little debates over like, what are we going to call this thing? Because it's a marketing problem, because otherwise everyone says it's a marketing problem. We're all going to be using it if we just come up with the right name, or the right 3-word message. It ain't true. So like when Zuck said that, a lot of people were like, oh no, we can't call it the metaverse anymore because Facebook is going to own it, or they're going to, make it shitty or something. Like, are we R-rated here? Can I say that? Anyway, so yeah, it's funny, but I think it's so exciting. And ironically for me to say it, we are still kind of early stages on so many things, though. I think the tech underpinnings are really getting super solid.
So let's talk about that, because I think there's a whole bunch of buckets of tech change. There's also some social and culture change that's accompanying this, which I think is worthy of identifying too. So you referenced artificial intelligence and how that may change things. Clearly the graphics technology has gotten way more advanced. The amount of polygons you can put out on the screen in very high speed is completely different.
Right.
Like if we imagined that happening in the 90s, I don't think I could even conceive of the hardware that would be capable of that.
Absolutely.
But we're talking about literally, I don't know, millions or billions of times faster hardware today than what we had available then. So there's that. There's also blockchain and Web3, and this is the Web3 Game Developers Livestream. So let's maybe just begin there, because you've also had your own journey through Web3 and blockchain technologies. For you, what do you feel the relevance is, I guess, to Metaverse, online world creation, game development, all of these things? You've touched all of those, but where does blockchain fit into that? Why is that something that adds to this?
I think there's several aspects of blockchain that excited me enough to go join a blockchain company. It wasn't just because my idol Neil Stephenson called me up and said, do you want a job? This is the direction the world needs to go in for a few reasons. Decentralization, it's a term we throw around a lot, but it has so many implications. Decentralized infrastructure technology, game servers that nobody owns and controls.
Like what Beamable does.
Like what Beamable does, I would want to be overt about it, but absolutely what you're working on, John, is super exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
Decentralized infrastructure, for storage and delivery and all that. I mean, this, we talk about a lot of things around ownership or money or crypto, and I'll get to that. But the infrastructure needs to be decentralized to enable freedom of choice for anybody creating experiences, building technology that can interoperate with an infrastructure like this. And so that's critically important. That second factor is ownership. That is digital ownership of your own goods, where you're not beholden to, some platform who actually owns it and you're renting there. And a related element is monetization, right? That we have digital currency backing digital goods through smart contracts, that can validate those. So all of those together are fundamental to create a free and open anything, in the future of the internet, right? So the term Web3 is actually born out of the idea of a third generation of the internet. And I forgot, you might remember who coined the term, I've forgotten their name, but it really is the next generation web, and the fundamental innovation in that, I hate to say it being a 3D graphics expert, it's not 3D graphics, It is ownership. Now there's another important piece of technology here, which is sort of live stream, live experience. To me, the defining characteristic of the metaverse, and this may be a spoiler for us today because we're cutting to the chase, but to me, it's about being connected live, whether it's live streaming like this or being in Discord or being in a Twitter space doing audio. It's this real-time communication that is then represented in 3D graphics or video that brings us all together there. But back to Web3, which was your point, and sorry, I could talk all day.
We can take it in a lot of directions.
And we can come back to it too, on the streaming side and the live side. Having decentralized control is fundamental to the future of anything that anyone wants to build, unless they want their future controlled by a large entity. And that could be a tech, service company. That could be a platform that's gating the distribution and what people can access, which then leads to real problems in free speech and some other things that we could touch on as well. So yeah, Web3 is fundamental from decentralization, ownership, and monetization, in my opinion.
We can talk about decentralization a little bit. I think sometimes people in blockchain talk about decentralization as if they invented the concept, but actually the internet was designed. The internet's
decentralized. Email is decentralized, right?
Email is a great example. Domain names, right?
Domain names.
So could you imagine a world in which to have an email account, you have to ask one company whether you're allowed to have the email account, and they decide what you're going to be allowed to do with email, or a domain name? Could you imagine that world in which to have a domain name, you have to subscribe to, I don't know, Microsoft's domain service or something, and they let you know whether you'll get to do it, what your price will be every year as it goes up?
I love Microsoft and what they've been doing the last decade. But you are probably old enough to remember that if it was 1997 and they had their way, that's the way it would have gone.
Yeah, and I'm not taking anything away.
They tried to own the entire internet for a while there, and then they actually got broken up for it. And the company's done so much better since then, right? Actually, better and better for everyone, right? So yeah, this is the point. Like DNS. Well, DNS itself is obviously mediated and curated, and there's a process you have to go through to get the domain name. There's governance around it, but it's not controlled. And that's one of the key aspects. It's like, any service in Web3. There's also governance for that. There can be, at least, right? Like an ENS or something like that. But the protocols behind it are open, and anyone can serve it up if they participate in the rules of how to serve it up in a decentralized infrastructure. Which, if it's okay, I want to kick it back to you to talk about Beamable.
Sure.
And educate me a little bit. I mean, obviously your listeners know you already, but I would love to hear like where Beamable is in that piece of decentralized infrastructure. DPIN, is that what we call it now? Well, is that term gone now?
No, DPIN is the category of technology that we're building at Beamable. So DPIN stands for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Network. So the idea is that you can have community ownership of infrastructure. So historically, if you go back to the original internet, when there wasn't that many users on the internet, people actually owned their own computers, right? They'd have a computer. It was everything from mom's basement. You might have a little rack.
And that was the web server, right? They were serving it.
Yeah. My first web server was running on a Solaris workstation in my office. So we actually ran it, hosted it on site on the T1, which would be a very low speed connection by today's standards. But that's how we got started. But then more and more users started coming. So you had a choice. You either had to build out a data center, very expensive, very capital intensive, also requires a lot of labor to run things for you. So what came out of that was companies like Amazon. And Amazon absolutely gets a ton of credit for pioneering in the space. As much as I'm going to critique the state of affairs today with big companies, like all these companies have done great things. Like we wouldn't have the internet as it is today without a a lot of these guys. But so Amazon created Amazon Web Services, and today it's millions of servers, basically. Right. They're what you call a hyperscaler, where you can essentially rent capacity on their machines. But what comes with that? Well, they tell you the tech stack that you have to use, although there's a lot of flexibility in it, but they essentially have their own tech stack. It's in their interest to get you more and more dependent on their own tech stack over time, because then you're stickier to them as a business.
Yep.
It's higher priced because you're renting servers versus owning stuff yourself. And there's a lot of value added layers and things like that on it. So in the specific case of Amazon, they've also released technologies that they've decided to discontinue that people have been dependent on. So a good example of that.
Yeah, you get locked in with someone, and then yes, they don't service a piece that you need because it's not in their interest anymore. Exactly.
In the game industry, they bought a platform called GameSparks, and like thousands of games were built on this. They decided ultimately to discontinue it post-acquisition. My understanding is the technology didn't actually scale that great, or there were some issues with it. So they decided to end that. But of course, they stranded many, many games as a result of that. A few could do the hustle and figure out how to completely change out their back end, but it's not easy to change out a back end once you've made choices. The point is, when you run an internet business of any kind and you choose a technology provider which is centralized, that gets to dictate the business terms to you, whether you get to be there at all, whether they like what you're doing, as well as access to technology that they may choose to either maintain or discontinue in the future, you're putting a lot of risk back on your business, not to mention typically the high costs of hyperscalers.
It's interesting. I mean, you mentioned renting, and it's kind of an interesting metaphor to explore for a second, because you are renting from them. But imagine this in the context of a home, right? So if you're a homeowner, you have a lot of hassle on your own. If you rent, the landlord takes a lot of that hassle away. So that's a choice you can make for a lot of people. But this is like your landlord also telling you what kind of furniture to have in your house and maybe what style of, clothing you wear around the house or something, So they're making choices for you that maybe
like
go
the worst
beyond
HOA.
Yeah, it's like the worst HOA. Or if you're a condo owner, there you go. That's the worst of both worlds in a lot of ways, right? So I think that's a kind of fair analogy, though it breaks down to a certain point. But yeah, so then there you are, you're locked in, and your world choices are being dictated in a lot of ways by someone who's a platform provider like this. So back to then DeepIn and Beamable. So bring us into that world then.
So the idea of DeepIn is you have community ownership of the infrastructure resources. So instead of one siloed company that owns all of that capital equipment, operates it, and dictates all the terms, you have a community that owns the infrastructure, and it can be spread across multiple companies. So in the Beamable DeepIn, for example, there are bare metal service providers. So bare metal service providers are data centers, basically, where they just give you computers,
give you the boxes,
and then you figure out what to do on them. Right. It's much less in terms of software infrastructure, tends to be a lot lower cost, but there's a lot left to you. But if you aggregate together a lot of these bare metal service providers, you're able to create the equivalent of a virtual hyperscaler, like an Amazon or like an Azure or like a GCP, because when you add up all these data centers around the world, it adds up to a lot, and they're secure and they're high bandwidth. They do all the things that you would need as a game developer to operate your back end, but at lower cost. And because it's spread across many providers instead of stuck with one, if one of them decides they don't want to be in that business anymore, you're not screwed. You just shift your traffic to somewhere else.
Right.
It functions as an order book, which is where some of the blockchain technology gets involved. Blockchain happens to be an ideal technology for running things like order books and identifying what is the price that I want to ask for when I'm offering my infrastructure back to the community. And conversely, if you're a game developer, what am I willing to pay? The order book then matches, makes sure that you get infrastructure at the market optimal price, but open, right? So what we're doing is taking our tech stack and deploying it in an open source manner across what's an open network. I think you could think of DeepIn as take the logic and the ethos of open source, but apply it to the world of hardware and infrastructure and data centers. That's what we're building.
So I wonder about this, and this reminds me of node operators on an Ethereum network or a Bitcoin network, and I'm sure that's actually pretty close as an analogy, right? So if I'm providing services into the Beamable DPIN, what is my economic incentive? Why are people doing this now? Because this is one of these keys to this whole thing is most and I want to get into it, unpack how it gets in, how we get into this for game development specifically, what game devs have to go through to serve things up, right? They're now going to come in and rely on a decentralized infrastructure. What are the people providing them that infrastructure getting in return? Because this only works and sustains if there's an economic incentive for both sides. It's a marketplace, right?
Great question.
So can we talk about that? Because I'm personally very curious. Have we not had this discussion in depth, you and me, before, right? But this is, it's fascinating to me.
Well, let's go back all the way to some of the earliest crypto mining that existed. Like, you can go back to Bitcoin. So what is Bitcoin? You run some software that happens to be solving a lot of cryptographic puzzles, and eventually you solve it and you get rewarded with a Bitcoin. So that's or multiple Bitcoins. So that's how Bitcoin mining worked. That's then how Ethereum effectively worked through proof of work algorithms. Now, over time, people discovered that for a lot of use cases, doing proof of work was just not really the optimal thing to do, because you end up with very high cost fees and expenses to do small transactions, and it wasn't good for a lot of applications such as games, for example. So games have a lot of little microtransactions, and you can't be paying $50 of Ethereum every time someone buys a sword, for example. So they started coming up with different algorithms called proof of stake. But what DPIN is doing is it's sort of going back to this original idea of essentially mining for a cryptocurrency, except instead of just running cryptocurrency puzzles, which is only of use to unlock the next coin in the proof of work algorithm, you're doing actual workloads that people need done. So,
and presumably way more efficiently.
Yeah, but exactly. And there's incentives all around, because the game developer has an incentive to make sure that they operate their game servers in a efficient manner, because they're going to pay for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Likewise, the data center service providers want to be paid for offering the service. So in essence, instead of mining for cryptocurrencies where you're just running crypto puzzles, you're actually running game servers. So that's really what the Beamable DPIN network is game servers that you can provision, and you pay the data centers for spinning up game servers for you, just like they could for any other service that they offer. And this model is really taking off in crypto, not only in our use case, which is game servers, but all kinds of things, storage. There's really interesting ones like Helium was probably the first one. Helium made it possible to have essentially a Wi-Fi hotspot, and you get paid in their cryptocurrency for offering Wi-Fi. So if you run like a small business where a lot of people are coming in and out all the time and you want to offer Wi-Fi service there, you'd actually be paid to offer them Wi-Fi service. And they've actually done now major deals with traditional telecom companies like T-Mobile. So it's starting to go way beyond.
And you need those multiple layers of the stack in this economy. And if those folks are starting to participate, that's going to make for better economies of scale for the software providers and so on, the infrastructure providers. So that's great to hear. That's really encouraging. And all right, so then Web3 gaming is going to take off now, right?
Well, that's a funny thing to say. So I'm
so out of that loop, right? I can't wait to hear what the latest.
Well, we can talk about Web3 gaming, and we can talk about Web3 enabled gaming, which I think is maybe two different things. So at Beamable, we have both kinds of game developers. We have Web3 game developers. So, for example, Mythical Games is probably our largest Web3 game developer. They've got things like the NFL license, Pudgy Penguins, the FIFA license. So worldwide, absolutely massive sports franchises that they're building games on based on Beamable. They're a Web3 game developer. But actually, most of our traffic is what you'd call in Web3, Web2, meaning just traditional MMOs, online games, multiplayer games of all kinds.
But using the DPIN with the Web3 infrastructure, you're saying.
That's the cool thing. So for years, we've talked, for at least the last 5 years, people keep bringing up this subject of onboarding game developers to Web3. The challenge with that has always been that you're asking game developers to change their business model, because having an open market game with a trading economy in it, first of all, that's a very complex kind of game to build well.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of them. I think Magic the Gathering was the non-digital version that came before all the others. There's lots of good examples where this can work. Roblox shows kind of a way it can work at scale. Minecraft, in some ways, even shows a way it can work at scale, not in blockchain, but in similar kind of trading economies. The issue, though, is it's good for a category of games. There are plenty of games that don't need a trading economy or an ownership economy, and I don't believe it's actually true to say that every game that exists is going to be like an ownership-based trading economy game. Like, I played Baldur's Gate 3, probably my favorite game of all time. I don't think it would have been made better with like a trading economy in it. It was good as implemented, and I wouldn't change much at all about that game. But those are games that represent a massive amount of the server footprint in the $200 billion
and they can benefit
game
from
economy.
Different infrastructure, improved infrastructure. Yeah,
exactly. So we're onboarding them to Web3.
Great.
They don't have to know a thing about Web3. They certainly don't need to change their game design. They just build the game the way they always would. We give you an SDK for Unity and for Unreal, and all the blockchain stuff is abstracted out. We provision off of the DPIN network automatically. You don't have to know anything other than we make your life a lot easier, and we get all your servers set up for you for your online game.
That's amazing. But now let's go back to the other one, the Web3 gaming one, because that's what because I get the Web3 enabled gaming part. And just as an engineer, as an infrastructure person in my DNA, when I'm not making musicals, I think that makes just total sense. If you can, again, line up all the pieces, the economic incentives to the service providers, economies of scale that actually work, technically, get it working efficiently, and get developers to embrace that, because it's just going to benefit them in the medium term. They'd have some switching costs, but then they're going to have some great benefits out the other end. But this other thing that's Web3 and gaming that had some real hype behind it for a while, and it's gone through a circuitous and tortuous path the last couple of years. Where are we at on that? Because I have no idea. I've been busy making music and art and not paying attention to this stuff for a while.
Real things.
Yeah, well, again, real fun things at least. So what's happening there?
Well, I mean, it's safe to say Web3 games have super struggled for a lot of reasons. Some have been successful, like I just mentioned, mythical games. Like NFL Rivals is a game that figured out a path to millions of users by front-ending it with a game that just looks and feels and plays like a traditional mobile game. And
based on a big IP.
And based on a big IP. And then after you're deep in, you discover the open trading network that also surrounds the game, which means you're going off mobile and into other places to engage in that. But the interesting thing with their business model, as I understand it, because I actually had John Linden, the CEO of Mythical, on just a couple of weeks back, he has explained that their ARPDAU, so average revenue per daily active user, has, it started out with very little Web3 revenue and more on the mobile revenue side. Over time, what the contribution to ARPDAU from the trading economy has actually become most of the game's revenue.
Wow.
So it's become a sustainable source of revenue for the company. So I think
that's really promising.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting model there. Obviously, collectible sports personalities is a well-worn idea from gaming, even before gaming, going back to trading cards and stuff. So it's an idea that I think translates really well to an ownership-based trading economy game. So I think there are signs where it's working. In there, it's a game that has had several million installs. FIFA, you could reasonably forecast, is even bigger. I think globally it's 3 or 4 times the size of NFL just in terms of audience. So maybe it'll factor up to that. There isn't a Fortnite yet, though. There's nothing massive.
And also, I assume you're not implying, and I don't think you are, that you have to have a big IP attached to this to make it successful. But it really is helping right now, in the sense that now we're seeing proof points. They are based on big IPs today, but it's just a matter of time that as people are seeing the money here, they're going to come back in. Some indie game developer is going to come up with some hit that we aren't even expecting. Yeah. That is trading based. That is pure Web3 based, and we'll get back into this cycle in a big way. I think is what I'm hearing from you. It's possible, right?
Yeah, I built IP-based games for years on mobile. So I built Game of Thrones and Star Trek and Walking Dead games. And anytime you have a brand new platform where there aren't a lot of entrenched competitors yet, having well-known worlds and IP, such as an NFL franchise or a Game of Thrones in my mobile example, that is a way to gather a lot of attention for a product. Now, I also found that over time, the benefit of that IP can go down a lot,
Right.
because you end up in this state of like competition between every IP that you can imagine and
Right.
every game IP. But that's not true in the earlier stages. So we
Right.
probably are at that earlier stage of IP within the Web3 ecosystems,
Right.
because they'll tend to have their own unique distribution channels. We don't really know what the distribution channels for Web3 are yet, other than that Telegram over the last year has gotten enormous traction with Telegram
Yeah,
games,
that's really exciting. Right.
which points to that. But but Web3 gaming generally, other than there are some real interesting early success stories like Mythical Games, they've struggled for a lot of reasons. One is on the business model side, we're still in the discovery mode there. Like, people have lots of hypotheses about what is the game design that's really going to work in Web3. Well, we know that something like Magic the Gathering works sometimes,
Right.
but there's also been lots of other ideas, and not a lot of them have shown to scale out for big mass audiences. So
Right.
there is still the experimental process that we're going through to discover the business model. Another is technological. We pointed at a little bit of it with the DPIN stuff.
Right.
There's just the reality of Web3 games is they're all inherently online games, because they've got
Right.
market systems and social systems and multiplayer systems typically. So your complexity level for the game has gone up a lot, and the technology to support that often just gets in the way of building a great game. So what you want a game developer to be able to do, and what I was when I was building games like Game of Thrones, is you just want your team to sit down in front of Unity, for example, every day and be working on a game, not be figuring out back-end infrastructure and
Right.
scaling it up to
Exactly.
millions of users. Or frankly, that stuff's just kind of boring. You have to do
Right.
it super well or you fail, but it's not fun to work on as a game
it's
developer.
highly specialized. And yes, it's not fun.
And your customer doesn't really care. They only care if it breaks.
Right. Exactly.
If you log into the game and it's like servers down, you're pissed off as the player. But when it works, these days the player just expects it to work. Like,
yeah, absolutely. They
so-
might care about what the pixels look like or what the gameplay is like, but they don't care about that, like you said, unless it breaks. Absolutely.
In the infrastructure side, though, like, we're hoping to have a future where you choose the most important parts of your game. You choose the front-end technology, Unity, Unreal, Godot, whatever you think fits the way you want to build your game and that delivers the game experience. And then infrastructure is just something you can build on top of without really having to think of it, as opposed to either the other options are build it all yourself, very, very capital intensive, very, very risky. Or you could try to build in one of these metaverse-y environments like Roblox, for example.
Well, then you're back to having the whole stack controlled, right?
Whole stack is
Roblox,
controlled.
The Fortnite, creator stuff, it's all basically controlled by one entity, right?
Yeah, and Roblox is what they've achieved is really fantastic. So I don't want to take anything away from the enormous success that Roblox has had. I think it actually proves a lot of the things that we've talked about for years. But they, in addition to the 70 or 80% take rate that they have, they also just make a lot of tech choices for you. So there are certain kinds of games you're not really going to be able to build in a Roblox. So giving people choice of technologies that they bring together gives them the ability to realize their vision.
Fun fact, 2010, Dave Baszucki hired me to port Roblox from the PC to the Mac. He had a failing project in-house, it was always like sort of second fiddle anyway. They're like, Mac, maybe we need to get it running on the Mac, but most people are on a PC. So I went in and fixed that project, and my son at the time, who was 10 or so, or 9, was the first alpha tester of Macintosh Roblox back in 2011. So I'm a huge fan, but I also know what the code base looks like inside. And I would just say, yeah, maybe you want to have some of your own infrastructure for that. No knock on Roblox, like you said, they've done what they do is amazing. But also, they have not only made tech choices for you, they've made art direction choices for you, right? So unless you want to build a game like Roblox or in Roblox, and then they made distribution choices for you. You have to have the game in Roblox, right? It's not like you're using that as an engine to put on your own site or for your own download, right? So it's back to that same thing we were talking about for FANG companies and infrastructure. They control way too much of the stack. And it has palpable results for the end user. So you're never going to build a AAA game in Roblox, no matter how hard you try. But the open worldness you get and all the ease of creation you get may be the right choice for you if you wanted to build something like that. So yeah, I mean, it's just back to having a big platform. It's controlling way too much of the stack. It's not good for the next gen of developers or for the open metaverse.
I mean, the interesting thing with Roblox is it's almost this midpoint between the world of traditional game studios on one side versus this market of UGC content. So UGC, user-generated content. I mean, there's huge games now that have started out as UGC projects, basically. Counter-Strike or even League of Legends was inspired by Dota, which was basically a mod. So UGC has spawned huge industries. Roblox kind of feels like it sits in the middle of that. It's like harder than a lot of UGC, way more constrained than a game studio would have the options for, but more flexibility than, say, just building a mod pack based on top of a game. But
it's funny, it is harder, but I mean, if you're 8 to 12 years old, you're in it. Like Minecraft, the same thing. That the hardness of it is the challenge. I mean, it's part of the gameplay actually to create in there. You know, the constraints and all the things you have to do. That's the kids who do that have this sense of mastery, right? There's an engine behind that's a social engine that if you get good as a creator in those systems, you are a god. Right?
I love that though too, because that's the other change that we talked about. Technology is changing, but culture is changing. So today we have a lot of game developers who started out where it was Minecraft or Roblox. It wasn't download Unity and start hacking together a project. It was Roblox is where you built a game. And in some cases, they ended up with fairly sizable, I mean, in the most extreme cases, kids became millionaires. They had millions of people playing it. But even kind of subscale, like you're building stuff where probably you got hundreds or even thousands of people to try it out. So you're interacting with audiences and you're crafting and creating. So that's a really interesting change as well. It's sort of like that YouTube moment, right? Like it used to be that creating media, for that matter, like we're live streaming video right now. Like what I'm doing with a iPhone on my camera and a MacBook and some online software and a couple of Snap-on mics, like to do this 20 years ago, we would have had a production crew in here.
Exactly.
Cameramen and all kinds of stuff. So
you should have seen 15 minutes before we went live, John had the manual out for these new little lav mics. He's this piece of paper. I'm like, okay, we're going live in 15 minutes, right? So yeah, it really has changed.
So, but yeah, and YouTube and live streaming technology has made video a lot more accessible. Well, now that's happening with games and immersive world creation.
Except, sorry, I got to cut you off for 1 second.
Yeah.
Except with YouTube, you make a video in a standard format.
True.
And you don't do that in Roblox. You don't do that in the Unity game engine. So this is full circle back to what I have been spending 30 years of my life working on. The formats that you build that 3D content in need to be completely open, or you really aren't going to have a true YouTube analogy here, right? I mean, you can take the video you put on YouTube and you can put that anywhere. It's not like you can't run it on another video service because it's MP4s, right? I mean, yeah, there are codec issues sometimes and all that, but in the large part, you need to have a world like that where the content was created in a way that was portable and interoperable across networks with the 3D content, and we're not there yet. So it's a glimmer of that, but it's not quite there when you come to Roblox or building in Unity. It's like they're missing that last step. You need to be able to create that content in a way that could be put somewhere else.
Is there always going to be a race between the standardization effort for that kind of immersive 3D graphics experience and just the people who are going to push the envelope on what's possible, but and intentionally get out of the box, like I don't know, Unreal Engine, for example, with like Nanite and Lumen and these new technologies that they've created to do more real-time geometry and lighting. Like that's not based on any standards. They did it because game developers wanted it, needed it, and maybe it's not even all the way there yet, but it shows you sort of this tension that exists between a standardization effort and just wanting to push the envelope on the possible. What's your thoughts on that?
It is a race.
Yeah.
It is the tortoise versus the hare, right? It is game engine tech is always going to move like the hare. But one day the game is just going to wake up and be like, oh, we should have done more of this with these kind of standards, right? Either the devs are going to say like, I'm sick of porting or whatever it is. Now, look, in gaming, this difference is really pronounced because game engine tech is way past what you can do in any web browser. But, and this is where it gets to a broader vision of what the metaverse is. If I am creating a character, if I am creating a virtual good, if I'm creating assets that I want to exist outside of my game, I should not need the engine to render those. That's content versus the gameplay. And so that's the world we need to get to. And it doesn't always have to be rendered photorealistically like a metahuman on the latest PC, right? I might want something that can run in a mobile asset that can just be in a mobile game or just put on a website and spun around to see if I like it before I buy it, right? And then when you get to use cases outside of gaming to the broader metaverse, create a 3D model of this space I'm in. I want people to see it all over the internet. Does it need every shadow and every little reflection? It might not, just to convey the sense of what is in here in this Hilton we're in right now. I think, depending on the use case, right? It could be just a simple 360 too, a simple spin. So a lot of it depends on the use case. But yes, the rendering quality of standards-based 3D is always going to lag behind what game engine companies can do. And if you're making a high quality, high production AAA game and you need the highest production value, I would never say don't use the best game engine you can find, right? So it depends on the use case and your economics, really. So it's an and, right? For many years, and this has been somewhat the bane of my existence, I think people have treated it like an or, like it's like, oh, I need it to look like that, so I'm not going to go bother with using these other technologies. And then they get it to look like that, and they realize that gave me this one limited use case and didn't actually give me what I needed, because you know what? I didn't need all that render fidelity to make this game. I needed better gameplay. Yeah. Right? But pixels, I mean, we're just so visual, right? The pixels really captivate people. And so, I mean, come on, it's like you go to E3 and you see all those trailers for the games. Those aren't the game, right? People make a slice of this thing, but they do it with like the pre-rendered CG, right? And then you go play the game and it's like, this doesn't look like the trailer, but it plays like it was promised, right? So I think it's fascinating. And I think the world has changed. And I think even the biggest game engine companies are appreciating the openness of this. Clearly, Tim at Epic, Tim Sweeney, is a big fan of open because he's been fighting that fight with the app stores with Apple and Google and everything from the economic side. But even Tim and that gang are so obsessed with rendering a metahuman that they often lose sight of the big picture. Though a lot of people at Epic are heavily invested in metaverse standards too. So I think the tide has shifted. But as someone who's kind of in that sense brushed up against gaming companies, game engine companies in particular, for a long time, for a couple of decades, it was frustrating for me. Though then, of course, it was very gratifying when I ended up getting a job at Unity. And I'd known David Helgeson for years, by the way, but there was never the time. The time was like, oh, now we have XR, we need more open 3D, we need, what was becoming the consumer known metaverse. And that signaled the shift, but the shift is taking a lot longer than I personally would have liked. So it's a race, but again, I think it's kind of tortoise versus the hare in the sense that eventually even the rendering will get commoditized, and then everyone really will understand that it's just like, I need to make my assets and my content in a way that they can be used in the developers in the most places possible. And the consumers will care if they've invested time and energy into purchasing or creating a virtual good that they want to move from one system to another.
And we also, and the lowest fidelity experience is also the most popular in the world. We shouldn't forget that too, which is Minecraft. There's, I don't know, 500 million users or whatever it is every month. I mean, it's absolutely massive, but it's a great platform for just creativity, which reduces things down to the purity of the experience and the gameplay and the interactions in a lot of these worlds, just the social schema that's in place, the progression mechanics.
Yeah, and immersion's in our heads, really, right? It's all in our minds, right? It could be physical playing cards, right? All the way up to the highest rendered game. And Minecraft is a perfect example of what you're talking about. Absolutely.
So we mentioned artificial intelligence a lot earlier. We've been through Web3. We can always come back to the blockchain aspects again. We talked about DePIN. We talked about some of the technological changes. You mentioned artificial intelligence. How do you feel that that's going to change things in terms of metaverse or just general 3D graphics creativity?
Well, like a lot of people in this world, I would say I'm a very big hypocrite when it comes to AI. I'm old, so I have a little bit of a get off my lawn feeling about it in some ways. I'm like, oh, here comes the next monster to potentially destroy us all. In my darkest moments, I'm fearful of a big extinction event long term. Not because there's anything in AI technology inherently bad. It's just that what will happen is people with a lot of money will give people with not much emotional intelligence free rein to go try and create a bunch of crap that might destroy us all. That's just the nature of the technology business. But that aside, I have been warming up to a lot of AI over the last couple of years. Midjourney, great. Know the founder, David's brilliant. He actually came to my backyard one day and was telling me, I'm working on this new thing, generative AI art. It was like, good luck with that, kid. I didn't get it at all. And then a year later, Midjourney's blowing up. It was like my dad when he said the electric guitar was never going to go anywhere. He was a musician too. I just didn't see it. I just blind spot. So, big Midjourney user, big ChatGPT user. But also as an independent artist, I'm worried about copyright infringement and other things that are happening with the machine learning. I'm worried about folks mistaking AI as this panacea that now anybody can be an artist. I think the big difference between anybody being able to create with a prompt and being an artist, and that is the thing of philosophy. And we don't have time in this session to get into it. So all these things taken into account, though, I'm using AI tools a lot now in my creation process. I use Midjourney a lot to generate art. Yeah. Now I can salve my conscience because my wife is a visual artist, and she's over my shoulder art directing the things I'm doing for any concept art or even production art. So in a sense, there's an artist in the loop in there anyway. So now with 3D, and I'm really excited for the possibilities of world generation in 3D. I think that is not a cure-all either. I think we still need artists involved in making that happen. I've got a slight bit of butthurt on one part of this, which is that a lot of people I talk to are like, well, AI is finally going to solve the 3D, creation. It's always been too hard. And I'm like, you know what? There's this middle ground of people just needed to make some good no-code drag and drop tools for a lot of 3D use cases instead of folks beavering away in Blender with this really crappy interface to make their art. And nobody's done a good job of doing that kind of easy 3D creation in a drag and drop tool, in my opinion, still. And everyone thinks, well, just magically add AI. It's not. You need all of those things. You still need good, intuitive, easy creation tools, level above the Minecraft and Roblox stuff where it's really easy. And then now imagine I use AI to generate the hard stuff, the 3D model part of it, the pixels, the polygons that go into that. That's still artistry, and if AI can help with that, that's really important for 3D because there's many more assets to make. The 3D world has a lot of assets in it. If you want to make them interactive, independent objects people can drag around, then wrap in a smart contract and turn it into a virtual good, right? Put code behind it. There's a lot of those assets that need to be created. And so, I'm just imagining this time when we walk up to the computer and say, hey, holodeck,
there you go, holodeck.
Make me a world, and boom, it's all around you. And maybe that ain't too far off. I mean, we've seen these things go, and they go in fits and starts, and then boom, one day there's an explosion because someone makes the next piece of computing hardware that makes that better, or there's a breakthrough culturally, and all of a sudden everyone's doing it and pushing this thing farther. So I think I think AI is going to get us the last mile. Excuse me. AI is going to get us the last mile on a lot of this stuff, and I don't think the generative AI tech is quite there yet. I think that there's more machine learning needing to be had, but I'm hearing murmurings that there's 3D Midjourney on the way, and so we'll see. I'm assuming the initial attempts will generate. It's like what's going on in music right now. The initial attempts will generate a world you can walk around in, but it won't be made up of separate objects. And then someone's going to have to take it into a tool and then bust it up. Like you do in music now, where the AI generates the music and then you bring it into some other tool to separate the stems. So then you can bring it into Logic or Pro Tools to actually then mix it. So it's kind of goofy and clunky. So the AI sees all this 3D content, and then the robot makes the 3D content like it's seen, but varies it for you, and then you like it. And then you have to go back to these crude production tools to break it up. So that's probably the next step we're going to see, but that's still, a step along the way.
The analogy there to some of the music tools that are currently available is interesting, though, because on last Thursday's program, we had a really interesting couple of guests, charismatic.ai. It's charismatic.ai, not charisma.ai, sorry. Charismatic.ai, and then Sloyd. So Sloyd is sort of operating in the world of procedural model generation, where they have a library of components that are parameterized.
Yeah, parametric, absolutely.
And then they combine them together. But they also use generative AI for prompting and essentially like a user interface into working with a procedural system. So there's really interesting.
So there's a language model, but then they extract this parameterized data and put it into the forms that are prompted. That's so cool.
I think that's right. And then but language models generally becoming a user interface to a lot of capabilities, that's kind of what the holodeck did. Like you could imagine the computer running the holodeck on Star Trek has a language model interface, and then under that are a zillion other like subsystems that it has to throw together.
Can we cut out that middleman and just go to a conversational interface though? I mean, you can do text to speech to text and get your prompts that way, but it's sort of then you're still just speaking the prompts. And we just get to the like, hey, I need this kind of world, and please, put it there, and then you make it the Victorian style. Okay, cool, let's try it. Nice. Yeah, like I thought about this. I mean, I'm not going to pat myself on the back. It's just odd how this works. More than 10 years ago, I was steeped in all the XR stuff, VR stuff, and I was thinking, why am I still like using Sublime Text to like write the code for a website? Like, can't I just walk up to my computer and say, hey, give me an e-commerce website, make sure it works on these platforms, use these packages, and boom. That exists now. I mean, typically you're typing that, or there are website builders now that do that. They have an LLM interface. You go type a prompt, and it gives you all this code. And there's a little code window, and you see the text, and then it gives you all the build errors half the time. It can't fix it, but it's getting there. Sorry, you were saying?
No, there's Claude has something called Cursor, where you, being either non-technical or just semi-technical, can almost dictate the kind of application you want it to build and work with it interactively. So much more of our world is going to become this language interface.
I'm a generation that's annoyed by it though, only because when I making my music, I put in my 1,000+ hours on all the instruments that I could play. When it comes to coding, I learned the hard way. And now, like, are these kids not going to have any of that pain? Probably not, right? So I like using the AI tools because I know what's behind them, and it's saving me time to do what I wanted to do. But with this new generation, is it something different? It's become more of a magic wand instead, and I feel like it's the magic wand now. It's wild.
Well, there was a day too when everyone had to code machine language, and you practically had to be an electrical engineer to figure out how to code. And then along came compilers and did all the work
never
for
would
you.
have made it through that phase. There were already compilers. I write compilers. I know what goes into those, but I would not have written those in machine language. I wrote them in higher level languages. Never would have been able to do that.
The thing I'm most intrigued by with generative AI, though, isn't just the make more stuff or make stuff faster aspect. It's what happens when we bring generative AI into the game loop or in the process of making things, or even music. I've imagined, like, is there a future form of music where you sort of create a certain amount of structure, but you have generative AI creating versions of it that is a little bit different for almost every listener?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of interesting things and just at the experience.
Make that a feature.
Yeah, that's the feature. So we'll make it hallucinate, and if it's weird, it's weird, and it's supposed to be weird.
So dreams are weird.
So yeah, they bring these 3D dream experiences to life. So that's an example of the generative AI being used in the play experience as opposed to like a production process enhancement.
Wow.
We could talk about that for hours, Tony, and we've covered a lot of ground today. Seems like we're
did we hit the hour already?
We're over by a minute.
What?
So just shows that we could keep going, and we will keep going because we're going to be on this panel.
In 1 hour, we're going to do this on a panel with two other
with a
people.
couple of other people.
Mix it up even more. It's going to be great.
Yeah. But Tony, thanks so much for doing this with me really early in the morning at South by Southwest. But we're getting it out. We're getting it out of the way before all the events for later in the day. We stole the stand. We don't even officially have this, by the way. We just decided to walk in and use it.
Don't tell anybody. This was great, man.
Tony, thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
It's been a blast. Tune in next week. We're going to be doing it live from GDC. So the Web3 Game Developer Livestream will be back. We're going to be doing it at the same exact time from GDC. We're going to talk to Dennis Didak, who's worked on some really legendary games in Web 2, things like Legacy of Kain, but now he's working on a Web3 game studio called Apocalypse, where they're using AI and blockchain and all of the cool stuff that we just referred to. So come back for that. And tomorrow we'll be talking to a couple of indie game developers in our traditional game development live stream. Churro Lamb and Renee Gittins were indie game developers for over a decade. They can tell you about their journey and how hard it is, but also how rewarding it is to be creative like this. So Tony, thanks a lot. This is super fun. Enjoy the rest of South by, and we'll see all of you online. Thank you for joining us once again.
I love that. We got your